that is posh. You know, I mean, that's not working class.
It's this great chasm between what they're trying to project and how they're being received.
Paula bloody Radcliffe.
Hi Beth, it's Paula Radcliffe here.
Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction from Sky News with me, Beth Rigby.
Me, Ruth Davidson.
And me, Harriet Harman.
We've got the perfect excuse to talk about our live show because Scott, one of our amazing listeners, has messaged us to say, hello ladies, I'm kind of gutted that I'm going to miss your live show in London, but I'm already going to see Kylie Minogue in Manchester on the same night.
Do we think that that's a reasonable excuse?
Well, I have to say,
Of an overlapping values
I actually can't turn up to our live show either because I'm also going with Scott to watch Kylie Minogue. So you two will be fine.
Are you wearing your gold Lammy hot pants and spinning around?
Well, I might. I might do.
I have to say, I think there's probably, if you took a Venn diagram of the sort of chaps that listen to our podcast, how many of them might also be Kylie fans? I think you'd get a bit of overlap, to be honest.
Well, Scott, we're sorry to miss you, but I mean, like, how can you compete with Kylie, the Queen of Pop?
Is she, or is she a princess of pop? I thought Madonna was the Queen of Pop and Kylie was just the princess.
I don't know. We're going to Harriet sort of adjudicate.
Yeah.
Harriet. Is Kylie the Queen of Pop or the Princess
She's
of Pop?
obviously the Princess of Pop.
Okay.
Oh.
1-0 to Ruth Davidson.
I have to say, Harriet coming in solidly square on my side there, loving it.
Well, you've agreed on something. Hooray! Okay. In all seriousness, remember, you can buy tickets for our live show. It's in London on May the 20th at Cadogan Hall.
And we'll put all the info on our socials, but you can also go to aegpresents.co.uk for more details.
Well, let's get on to today, rather than just shamelessly using this platform to plug our live show. We have got a lot today about last week's Supreme Court ruling on the definition of a woman. We're going to talk about the repercussions from that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to you guys discussing that because when the judgment was handed down, I was like, I'd really like to hear what Harriet and Ruth have to say, but it was Easter weekend and no one was around. But we are back and we're going to talk about that. We've also got Luke Trill, who is from More in Common. He has done a special focus group for us with voters in Doncaster ahead of the local elections next week. There's also some mayoral elections and there is a by-election. That is absolutely fascinating. So we've brought Luke into the studio as well. Now, as I was saying, whilst we were on holiday last week, Parliament was in recess. There was a pretty seismic judgment in the Supreme Court because they decided on the legal definition of a woman, which they said refers to biological sex. So the sex you are assigned at birth. It was a big moment, Harriet, wasn't it?
It was. And what they did in their 88-page ruling from the Supreme Court, as you say, the highest court in the land, is that they decided about the provisions of the Equality Act. And it comes amidst a very toxic and controversial issue. But it was basically deciding on the interpretation of the Equality Act. What does the Equality Act 2010 mean when it talks about protecting trans people from harassment and discrimination? And what does it mean about protecting safe spaces for women? And can they exclude trans people on certain grounds? And what it did is decide what the Equality Act was saying on the balance of rights.
The balance of rights. But a lot of people didn't feel like that, did they?
Well, I think what's kind of interesting about the initial reaction to this was everybody from all kinds of the political spectrum came out and they said they welcomed the clarity that the Supreme Court had provided. But actually, as we've seen over the last week, it hasn't stopped the debate of what the practical applications are. There's still sort of contest in terms of what does it mean for trans rights, for women's rights, for access to single-sex spaces.
Look, this has been a really divisive ruling. It is politically a very contested issue. It has provoked really strong feelings on both sides, and we have had loads of messages come in, and we will come to some of those too in a minute. Ruth, really divisive. And the case actually started in Scotland, didn't it?
Yeah, it did start in Scotland. It started quite a long time ago. It started way back in sort of 20 1718. Lots of people think of the law as a thing, as an entity. There's like the law of the land. And actually laws are more like, to me, they're more like books on a shelf. And sometimes you get a book that comes after a previous book that's been written that contradicts it or challenges it. And there was this really innocuous piece of legislation, really niche, called the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Bill. And it didn't spark that much controversy when it passed. And then for ages after, nothing happened. And just to sort of give you a little bit of insight of how innocuous this bill was, about 6 months after it passed, I was at a private dinner in...
Can you just remind us of the date of this? Because all the timing is really crucial.
So the timing is quite crucial. So the bill passed in January 2018. It became, so that's when the bill passed Parliament. It became an act, so it became the law in March of 2018. And then maybe September of that year, I was at a dinner. And the reason that I know roughly when it was because I was massively pregnant with my son. There was only 7 people at the table. And it was the first time I'd ever met J.K. Rowling, who was also at this dinner. So Jo Rowling was there. And because I was there with Jen, and because we were the only single-sex couple that were at the table, and because I was so massively pregnant, and the kind of only gay pregnant politician in the country at the time, so there had been some social commentary about it, we chatted about some gay issues, and we talked about politics and what had been going on in Scotland and what had happened since the referendum. I didn't reference this act. She didn't reference this act. She ended up underwriting some of the legal costs for this group that challenged it later on. It wasn't contentious at all. And then 2 years after it passed, more than 2 years after it passed, a campaigning group called For Women Scotland decided that the provision about transgender women being considered women had massive implications in lots of other areas. And in that time, in that sort of intervening couple of years, the whole debate about trans rights, women's safety, single-sex spaces, all of that had gotten a lot more heated. And it's been through several rounds of court judgments in Scotland. And then it ended up at the UK Supreme Court because part of the contention was that this challenged UK-wide law on what a woman is. I think this is probably where I would want to step back and pass it to Harriet, because Harriet, actually, you wrote the 2010 law, which was, being challenged by this 2018 law that had passed in the Scottish Parliament.
Well, I think what Ruth's done is do a very good description of the background to what led up to the Supreme Court case. And really, the Scottish legislation became a legal lightning rod for a debate and a controversy which had started to really rip and become very polarised and very toxic. But it's worth remembering it wasn't always like this when there was discussion about trans rights or discussion about single-sex spaces. It wasn't always a battle with people in two very polarised camps, really hating each other. And if I go back to before the Equality Act, we had the Gender Recognition Act, which gave people a right to change their gender for the purpose of their passports or their driving licence or for getting married. But it didn't give them any protection against discrimination or harassment, which is what a lot of trans people suffered and still do suffer. So when we came to the Equality Bill, we wanted to put rights and protections in for trans people in that bill, alongside the protections we were extending for women on race, on disability, on age and sexual orientation. We wanted to include trans rights in that bill and clarify the law there. But we recognised that there would be women's organisations who had fought for single-sex safe spaces for women, particularly women who'd been subjected to male violence against them, who would not feel happy about a trans woman in those single-sex services. So what we did is we got round the table the organisations who were advocating for trans and the women's organisations and the service providers, and we reached a compromise so that the trans people recognised that they could get extra rights to protect them from discrimination and harassment, but that they would accept an exclusion, a narrow exclusion from single-sex spaces when those single-sex spaces were provisioned for women who'd been subjected to male violence. So they accepted that. And the women's organisations and those providing refuge spaces accepted that you couldn't have a blanket ban on trans women. You'd have to actually show that you'd been reasonable and you'd made a judgment in the circumstances. So we built that consensus, and, it was tireless, painstaking work of round tables and getting people in, and not just discussing with one group and then discussing with another group. We got them discussing together about what they could settle on, and that formed the basis of the Equality Bill. And it came into Parliament, and that was not controversial, and it was supported by everybody. And that consensus lasted for about 10 years. And what unravelled the consensus is that, I think, first off, the Women and Equality Committee looked at trans rights in terms of the gender recognition process. And I think that was fair enough. The law had been in since 2004, but it had had a bit of time to settle in. It was worth the Women and Equality Committee looking at those rights to see whether or not the law was working properly in terms of gender certification, or whether it was too bureaucratic and too onerous, and how many people were getting gender recognition certificates for having changed their gender. But what they didn't look at is those rights in the context of women's rights providing single-sex spaces. So they looked at one side of the consensus. They didn't look at both. And they made some suggestions which led towards and became part of a campaign for self-certification, which is that basically you drop all the process and you just simply self-identify as having changed an agenda, which was then matched with people saying, we'll have self-certification and we will abolish the exception in the Equality Act, which allows for women-only spaces to exclude trans women. So it was those two things, pressing for self-identification and pressing for dropping the Equality Act protection of same-sex spaces. Now, those law changes never happened. But what happened was the debate and the campaign completely blew apart the consensus, with women who were running safe-sex spaces feeling that they couldn't actually exclude trans women because otherwise they would be judged as acting unlawfully, which they wouldn't have been, and trans people feeling that they hadn't got the rights that they wanted. And the consensus blew apart. And I think what we've got to do now is, with the Supreme Court having clarified what we said all along in the 2010 Act, that consensus has got to be rebuilt, because I strongly believe that most people don't like to see trans people discriminated against and persecuted, and they want to just live and let people get on and live the best lives they can. And most people understand that if you're dealing with women who've been traumatised by male violence, it might be that actually a trans woman there prevents them feeling they can be comfortable in a refuge or in a counselling session. And I think most people are in that reasonable common ground. And the debate has become toxic and been captured by the polar extremes. And I think we need to lead a rebuilding of that consensus that we built in 2010.
I guess the question that pinged up in my mind as you were talking about the Equality Act and the way in which it sought to preserve single-sex spaces for women in the case of, say, women who had suffered domestic abuse and wanted to go to female-only refuge. Part of the issue was that the whole issue around trans people and trans women's rights versus women's rights, it kind of spilled into other areas as well. It spilled into the use of toilets, women in sport. I mean, even the question of all women shortlists for Labour, is that part of the reason that the debate became difficult? Because the areas became greyer and the debate expanded into areas that were not so black and white, because a lot of people could perhaps understand the issue of refuges, but how would it work with toilets? How does it work with women in sport? How does it work with, all-female shortlists?
Well, I think in the face of a lot of campaigning, vigorous campaigning for greater trans rights, some organisations lost their confidence about their ability to, on certain grounds, exclude trans women. And they forgot about that exception, which, if anybody wants to look at it, it's it's Schedule 3, paragraph 28 of the Equality Act. They forgot about that because actually the law always allowed for people to make common sense decisions and make reasonable judgments which were fair and tolerant. And that's what's got to be recaptured, is that the law provided the framework for people to do the right thing rather than think that they've got to just tick a particular box and go in one particular direction. And it is the story of rights because, you've got a right to free speech, but it's not unfettered. You can't promote race discrimination. You've got a right to walk about the country freely, but if you commit a crime, the state has got a right to lock you up. The whole thing about rights is that they're never absolute, they're always balanced. And what you need is a framework that people understand and feel confident in to go about their business within that framework.
It's brilliant that you've both given us context and explained the background to it, but it is also been very, very contested. We've touched on that and you've explained a bit, Harriet, why you think that was or is. But before we go any further, should we hear from one of the people who feels affected by this judgment? This is from Ellie.
Hi, my name's Ellie. I'm a 25-year-old trans woman from Glasgow, and I'm just devastated by last week's ruling, and I'm scared and I'm angry. And I don't think there's clarity yet as to what this ruling actually means for my community in law. The thing is, in the UK, the courts interpret the laws, they don't set them. So this ruling shows that the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act clearly don't work in the ways that they were intended. I mean, the GRA has now been rendered practically meaningless. And the UK government could respond by saying, yep, fair enough, let's get them updated so that we can make sure that trans people are respected and protected in society for who they are. But instead, they've pounced on us, with government ministers even suggesting that trans women can't use women's spaces like toilets. I mean, where am I supposed to go? It's clearly not safe for so many trans women like me to use the men's toilets, not to mention completely dehumanizing. It's clearly not appropriate for a male police officer to get to pat down my chest. And it's also clearly completely unworkable. This whole thing is being done under the guise of making some women feel safer, while actually making so many of us, whether trans or not, materially less safe. And I don't even think we'd be having this conversation if the media and some politicians hadn't spent the past 5 years demonizing us. It just feels so cowardly and cruel. And it makes me genuinely just so scared for any future that I might have in the UK.
Thanks for sending that in, Ellie. Ruth.
Yeah, we also had this email. It came in anonymously, but I'd like to read it. It says, "Hi Beth, Ruth and Harriet. My girlfriend is a transgender woman with a gender recognition certificate and is also a survivor of a serious sexual assault. Losing rights under this ruling may put her and other transgender women in danger. The things that these people are no longer entitled to may include specific counselling after sexual assault, no longer being able to use the bathroom and other single-sex spaces which they feel comfortable in, and no longer being able to be allocated female-only hospital wards. My girlfriend feels lucky because she passes well, having been on hormone replacement therapy for years, and lots of the wording seems to be based around the idea of passing, but she still feels in danger. As a victim of sexual assault, using the male bathrooms must be an emotional pain that I can't begin to understand. We are scared for the future, and we honestly don't know how to move forward."
I mean, ultimately, Harriet, in terms of the ruling, regardless of how much surgery a person might have had, what gender recognition certificate they might possess, in the eyes of the law and the interpretation of the Equality Act, a trans woman cannot be a woman in the same way as a female who's born with the XX chromosomes are. Now, for some people, I mean, Ellie's saying it's unbelievably cruel. It's cruel for those trans women. For many people, it is just common sense. How do you try to navigate this? I mean, you put out a statement welcoming the ruling last week and you got absolutely attacked on both sides for what you said. I mean, what's your view? Like, how do you navigate this? How can we navigate this?
I think it's really sad to hear the fear that there is in the trans community, that the harassment and discrimination which so many of them encounter is going to be made worse, and that somehow they've lost rights under this ruling, because this ruling hasn't taken away any rights. It hasn't taken any rights away from the Gender Recognition Act. It hasn't taken away any of the protections that's in the Equality Act against discrimination and harassment directed towards trans people.
I think some of the issue here is being on the practical application of this, and in terms of how public bodies, how public services have chosen to interpret things. And also when you were talking about how the heat of the arguments on this has dramatically risen in the last 5 years at the same time as some of these court cases have been going through and we kind of got to the Supreme Court. A lot of those flashpoints have been around application. So I'm thinking of things like there was a person who was trans, whose trans-identified name is Isla Bryson, who was convicted of rape, which in Scottish law can only
before they transitioned
can only be committed by a man, but was put in the female prison estate, was put in a female prison because the Scottish Prison Service thought that they had to. They thought that their guidelines were that they had to put all trans-identified people in the kind of in the female prison estate.
I was very perplexed when I heard that decision because, of course, prison governors can decide, and the prison estate is used according to security, and there is complete discretion. So, for example, there have always been women prisoners for one reason or another who've been in the male estate because they're particularly dangerous. And I think a lot of the time the problem has been caused by people feeling they've got to do something which they know doesn't make sense. And then they do it and they then say, the law made me do it, when in fact the law hadn't made them do it.
And I think we've got to go back to
people feeling confident that they can use their common sense judgment. And that's what people need to do when they're running, whether it's a health service or schools or hospitality services, or single-sex spaces. They've got to feel confident that they can use their own judgment. You don't have a lawyer sitting next to you the whole time in everything that you're doing when you're running your business or running your public service. And you just need to bear in mind you can have single-sex spaces if it's reasonable, because the service you're providing requires you to be able to exclude trans women. But I think you mustn't generally exclude trans women.
I think this is some of the fear that we're hearing, particularly from the trans community, of people talking about rights that they have lost. And the court has said, well, actually, these are, in a sense, rights that you never had. And that's very difficult to hear because it's always been about the application.
People's difficulty in understanding where the law wasn't a thing for 10 years when there wasn't the political controversy. We don't, following the Supreme Court's ruling, need a change in the law. What we need is the consensus rebuilt, and we need sensible guidance.
This is where I want to pick up, Harriet, because the big question really is that the Supreme Court has interpreted the Equality Act. There is now clarification on what defines a woman when it comes to same-sex spaces, and that is clearly a biological woman at birth. That's clear. It also restates the need to protect the rights of trans people. And then someone has to go through and work out what this means, how you might issue guidance to public bodies. Who does lead on this? Because my impression, quite frankly, is that I don't think Keir Starmer wants to lead on this because, as you said, it's politically toxic. It has created a lot of political battle lines.
I think the Prime Minister did, in Prime Minister's Questions, make three very clear points: that he supports the ruling of the Supreme Court. But I think that, three things need to happen. One is that people need to feel confident that they can make common sense decisions and they can exclude trans women from women's only single-sex spaces, but only if it's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Secondly, there's got to be guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which actually underpins the confidence that people should have that they can make reasonable decisions. And thirdly, that consensus that we did have in 2010 and which fell apart needs to be rebuilt. And I think all of those three things can be done, and we can get back to a situation which most people want us to be in, which is they want women protected, and especially women protected from who've been subject of male violence, but they also at the same time don't want persecution of trans people.
Well, in terms of listening to all of the voices, and even ones that disagree with you, there will be people I know out there who think that we've only taken a couple of voices from this debate in terms of the voice note that we had and email. We will return to this topic at some point. Do tell us what you think. We want to know what you think. And indeed, we are so committed to listening to our listeners and what we think. In just a few moments after the break, we're going to listen to a whole focus group full of voters in Doncaster that talk about a whole range of politics as well.
Right, ladies, while it's very lovely to be here in the studio with you, we are really bunched in today because we have a very special guest. We have Luke, one of the rare sightings of a man on this podcast. Welcome, Luke. Why are you here? Who are you? And what are you doing?
Why am I here? It's a good question.
I mean, I
question.
I ask myself that every morning,
Yeah.
but anyway.
It's a good question. I'm here because this week we ran a focus group for the pod in Doncaster. Doncaster is one of the places which will be having local elections and a mayoral election next week. It's also a particularly politically interesting area because it is ground zero for where we know Reform are on the march. It's an existing Labour area, but also an area the Conservatives did reasonably well in 2019 under Boris Johnson. So it's a really exciting political area and helps to tell, I think, some of the story of the election that we are heading towards in, less than a week now.
Do you count as a Svengali, Luke? A polling and focus group Svengali?
I'm not sure that. I think, there's sort of different gradations. I think we all sort of aspire to get to sort of Curtis level, but none of us can ever quite meet the great John Curtis, but apprentice maybe.
A demi-Svengali.
Apprentice Svengali.
So, look, we have got some really interesting comments from this focus group, which I sat in on. It was absolutely fascinating, but less from me, more from them. Shall we kick off, Luke? What about kicking off with what you asked them about some of the big issues for them, those voters in Doncaster? What did they say about that? Let's have a listen.
The cost of living, it's coming from every single angle. It feels like all your bills are going up. The shopping's just going up ridiculous amounts.
It's everything going up, and sort of the wages across the board don't really reflect the increase in the overall cost of living either.
Yeah, and the NHS as well, I think, as a whole. I don't think it's the staff for a second. I think it's the funding.
Having more issues with NHS, especially now. Let's say go to the GP's situation that nowadays you don't really have a face-to-face contact with your GP anymore.
Immigration, I think, is a big thing. And, you hear all these stories that they're getting housing, and we've got people over here waiting for British people waiting for houses that aren't getting it.
I mean, it's too many people who come across here in UK, like illegal. And the thing is, because of these people, I think it's happened too many crimes. Okay. Because they can work, right? They need to survive, so they're doing something else, so they're forced to make crimes.
I'm going to say knife crime. I think that's one of the big things here. There's something happened, there's an issue every day.
There we go. We've got cost of living, NHS, immigration, crime. Luke, is that kind of what you would expect to hear from voters? You do these groups all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that feedback on the top issues could have been from almost any of our focus groups, any of the areas, actually, which are going to be voting next week. Almost always someone brings up the cost of living first. And it's quite interesting, sort of in SW1 in Westminster, the sort of chat about the cost of living seems to have gone down as inflation's falling, wages are rising. That is not what we hear in the focus groups. People keep on saying it's getting worse, the cost of living, often followed by the NHS, where everyone has a story about being stuck on a waiting list or someone they know stuck on a waiting list, and then immigration. And the interesting thing is that matches the polling too. If you ask about top issues, number 1, cost of living, number 2, NHS, number 3, immigration.
You know, they're the kind of standard top 3. Immigration has risen up, and the economic issues become more or less sort of at the forefront, depending on how rich or poor the country feels, whether it's in a boom time, whether it's in a tough time. And I completely understand why it feels tougher, and it doesn't actually matter. And it was the same, I thought this, and we talked about this on the run-up to the election in July, when you had Rishi Sunak talking about how we turned a corner and how it was, you know, better, and we're now one of the fastest growing in the G7 in terms of economic growth. And people did not feel that at all, and they didn't want their politicians telling them they were better off when they went to the supermarket and they had less money left after they'd done their shop, you know, and things were costing more, and they had less money left after they paid their bills, because they could touch and feel that, and not some git on the telly in a posh suit telling them that they were richer when they felt poorer.
And I think what the undertone, particularly in that section, but throughout the group, was it's not just that people think that the UK is in a bad state, you know, cost of living is bad, the NHS is bad, struggles with immigration, crime. It's that they don't have faith in our political class to find solutions. I said recently, I think the UK public mood's in a bit of a doom loop at the moment, and we can't seem to find a way out of it and how that changes.
It's very sad to hear people feeling that politics is not delivering for them and that their politicians can't be trusted. I feel people should be entitled to live in a country where they can believe in the system and they do have trust in their politicians. Nobody wants to see an age of sort of supine deference towards politicians put up on a pedestal.
Look, Harriet, you have hit the nail on the head, and Luke, pressing the change button. Our group had a lot to say about how disillusioned they were with politics. And if Keir Starmer liked listening to the fact that people were tapping into the missions, as you said, Harriet, that he set out, the rest of that group about what they thought about politics and particularly about him, that is not easy listening at all. Let's have a listen to what they had to say.
I just feel like I've lost a bit of faith in it all, and I think I don't really believe in what any of them say. I don't really like any of them anymore. Yeah. So I wouldn't... No, and I wouldn't just vote for the sake of it. I just wouldn't know where to vote, if I'm honest, right now.
Across the board, a lot of them are the same in terms of they don't really understand how just a normal working person lives their life, sort of thing, and what they have to put up with and what they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I don't really see any party that is any different, really. I mean, it comes back to just unfulfilled promises every single time.
It really don't matter who we have in charge. None of them have got any clue about the common person in this country. They've all from extremely privileged backgrounds. They all went to private schools down at Harrow or Eton or wherever it is. They really don't understand, I don't think, what 90% of this country go through on the day-to-day. I think that they probably think they understand it by going out to places that are more deprived or what have you, to try and understand it by speaking to people. But I don't think you can understand it unless you've actually experienced it properly.
I don't know what to say about them, who to trust, you know what I mean? Because they blame each other, and that's the thing. I don't know.
I don't vote. I shouldn't be complaining. I've got to, so I will definitely vote. I think it's different in local elections. I'm not looking at the party, I'm looking more at the person and what they've done for us locally.
Well, look, there's lots to unpack in there. Can we start with, though, something that really struck me when I was listening in on the focus group the other night, Luke, because the whole group just thought that Keir Starmer was really posh and out of touch. And you asked this very clever question, imagining what would the respective leaders, Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer, order if they were out at a restaurant. And of course, Nigel Farage had endless fish and chips or, steak and ale pie with a pint. But Keir Starmer, it was like he'd have lobster, he'd have caviar, he'd have something really fancy. And I was really struck by this because I was like, am I living in this parallel universe where all I've heard him say for all of that time into the election was, my dad was a toolmaker, my mum worked in the NHS, I'm from a working class background.
Yeah, but we've had this conversation where actually, I mean, the school I went to in Buckhaven and where I grew up and the people that I grew up with and the number of kids that were on free school meals and the fact that I grew up in an area of multiple indices of deprivation, I think is what we call it now. But basically, an area of industrial decline, thinks that somebody whose dad was a toolmaker, that is skilled working class, that's a skilled engineering, and whose mum works in the NHS is a white collar job. That's not a blue collar job. That is posh. You know what I mean? That's not working class. The idea that that's what this lawyer from London thinks working class people are is in itself a signifier for some people.
I guess
like,
it's
I don't
like
think he's eating caviar and steak.
Yeah.
But also the idea that saying that, you know, my mum had a white collar job working in the NHS, that's a good job. It's got a pension. You've got job security in that.
I guess the thing I found really interesting about that is the whole mission that he and his Chancellor say repeatedly is that they are in the service of working people. And part of that is their own narratives about where they came from and therefore what their political values are. And there's this great chasm between what they're trying to project and how they're being received, Luke. I mean, I find that fascinating.
Totally. And look, people sometimes say, like to focus groupers, why are you asking what people would have for lunch or what animal a politician would be? But actually, it's where you get some of the most honest answers for people, because most people don't think about politics or data. They think about people as sort of characters and imagers. And that's where you get that real insight. Like, look, you know, Nigel Farage, he's, you know, traditionally British, man of the people. That's why he's having the, I think lots of people said pie and chips, pie and mash as well in the group. And Keir Starmer, you know, as someone said, you know, there's fish eggs, caviar. That's what we have. So I think it is, you know, I think it partly is what Ruth said, that, you know, it is, you know, seen as a, you know, sort of more lower middle class jobs are different to working class jobs. But I think there's something else as well, which he's always been really held back by the Sir Keir thing. And I've had people in other groups say things like, I mean, this is a direct quote, you know, well, Tony Benn, he had one and he gave his up. So if Keir Starmer really wanted to show he was in touch, he'd give up his title. Of course, not going to Tony Benn had a hereditary title, but actually it's just that Sir thing. And of course, that's why the Conservatives during the last election so often kept on referring to him as Sir Keir, because it reinforced that image with the public, and it just kept on coming back in focus groups, this idea that he's out of touch. And also, you know, being a lawyer as well, you know, for lots of people, you know, being a lawyer is very posh. Indeed, he was a very senior lawyer. So, you know, it might be slightly unfair, but that is very definitely what's cut through.
But the default situation that everybody thinks that all politicians are posh and don't understand their lives, it reminds me that Sadiq Khan came under a lot of criticism because every single moment he appeared on any media or social media, he would always say, my father was a bus driver and I was brought up on a council estate in Tooting. And everybody used to groan, oh, what's your father? He's obviously a bus driver, because he said it. But in a way, you obviously have to over and over again say it.
I think the point I was trying to make was, for a lot of people in this country, having somebody who is the Prime Minister, standing in a suit, who is a sir, who, you know, is a lawyer by trade.
From North London, and a lefty lawyer as Johnson.
Yeah, but nobody outside London has a clue about North London versus South London.
I know, but you know,
nobody.
Now I'm interrupted here, and that's annoying. But you remember you talked about how if you don't frame yourself, opposition politicians will frame you.
They'll give you your
I'm
adjectives.
just thinking about how Johnson framed Starmer quite effectively when Johnson had the megaphone and Starmer was the leader of the opposition. Do you remember? It was like, he's a lefty lawyer from London. He's a posh guy. He's next door to Jeremy Corbyn. They're all sort of hand-wringing wokies. You know, he's not a man of the people. He doesn't understand your lives. And that was quite effective. That was effective, wasn't it? It was effective tactic.
But having that person then saying, but I'm really secretly more like you because my dad was a toolmaker, has, like I say, day labourers going, well, do you know, that's a great job.
I think in a way he's got to recast himself as somebody who did come from a quite ordinary background, but was bloody good. And that's why he ended up
but I think
as a sir.
The disconnect between the views that were expressed in your focus group, Luke, and politicians generally, because like you say, Harriet, there's loads of people in politics go, that's not fair, that's not who I am, if you just knew. But there's something about standing in Parliament while wearing a suit, talking in parliamentary language, that immediately creates a divide for people.
It does.
Because it's otherness. It's this idea of otherness. And it doesn't matter necessarily that you've got a background like Angela Rayner's, becoming a granny very young, being a very young single mother, growing up in insecure situation on a housing estate. People look at you now, you're earning 100 grand a year, you're wearing a posh
think
suit.
that about Angela Rayner, and I don't think they thought that about John Prescott either. I think there's some people where there is that class identification, but I don't think it holds if you become a Casey and a top lawyer.
If you ask people which politicians they can identify with, it is, people do say Angela Rayner, people would have said John Prescott, people say Andy Burnham. But interestingly, people also say Boris Johnson there. He doesn't get the same criticism that Keir Starmer
Who went to Eton.
Who went to
and then went to Oxford.
And people will say, he gets it. Boris Johnson, he understood it. He really got it, particularly in some of those red wall seats, places like Doncaster. There is a sort of, and I think there is something, and we pick this up quite a lot in focus groups, is that people like politicians who seem like they're enjoying the job. They're a bit, they're hair shirt about politicians generally, but if you ask about the politicians they relate to, I think it's the ones who look like they're having a good time. So Nigel Farage sometimes, Boris Johnson, Angela Rayner, John Prescott, and I think Keir suffers and comes across as a little bit stiff and removed and perhaps posh because he doesn't look like he's enjoying the job very much.
That's such an interesting analysis, because when we had our landslide victory in 1997, Tony Blair said to us all, when we were going, yes, punch in the air, this is a fantastic result, don't look as though you're enjoying it too much and reveling in your power. Everybody will hate you and think you're arrogant. So we had to conceal our exuberance under gravitas faces. Now I'm hearing from you, Luke, that we should have been allowing our jubilation.
I'm just absolutely hearing the Scottish education that Tony Blair got at school coming out there. That's Calvinism writ large right there. Fetty's the very posh private school he went to in Edinburgh has got a lot to answer for. Oh, don't look like you're enjoying yourself now. People won't like it.
But let's get back to the focus group. As much as I love the idea of talking about Tony Blair's, do not enjoy yourself while listening to this podcast, all right? I'm having a terrible time all day, every day. I mean, one thing as well about this focus group was, and talking about politicians and how they are perceived, is also about what you were saying, Luke, which is really structured, like pressing the change button. Because there's one guy out there, isn't there, Nigel Farage, who seems to be having a great time going around the country, handling endless pints of bitter, not lager, bitter. He seems to be having a great time, but also he is the guy pressing the change button at the moment. The whole montage of the reform campaign is Britain is broken. Go on their website. It's all about broken Britain and how no one is the change apart from reform. It was really interesting what the focus group had to say about reform versus Badenoch and the Conservatives, and also Labour, because they're coming not just for the Conservatives but Labour too. Let's have a listen to that.
I think he thinks he's a celebrity more than a politician, really. And he does things for effect. I wouldn't trust him to run the country at all.
I think he's got unconventional ideas, which is probably what we need. He does things for a reaction, but he just doesn't go along with what's always been done. He just sort of has different ideas. I mean, I think he's got some extreme ideas and he might need sort of reining in a bit.
I think he likes feeling influential, but I tend not to really trust him.
He says some good stuff, but then again, some of his stuff probably don't make sense.
That was a bit of Farage and reform. Let's listen to what they had to say about the Conservatives and their leader, Kemi Badenoch, and then Luke can unpack it all, and then Harriet and Ruth hopefully will have a ding-dong.
I think they're doing terribly. I think most people in the country don't even know who the leader is. And I think she's not very high profile in the first place. And you never hear of her. Personally, I liked Rishi Sunak and I like Boris Johnson. At least you knew what you'd got with Boris.
I think Boris was massively popular, wasn't he, with left wing, right wing, everybody liked Boris. They're going to have to do something radical, either bring Boris back to compete with reform, because I think it's going to wipe their vote out completely.
I think they're probably playing quite a clever game at the moment. I don't think it would be within their interest right now to start spouting and trying to compete, and I think they're doing the best thing to just lay low for a little bit.
I was like Boris, me as well. I was like him because he was like pretty much like us, you know what I mean? Like normal people.
If you've got no public image whatsoever and also no trust, then you're not going to pull any votes.
I don't know where to even start that. I mean, it was brutal on Kemi Badenoch. Luke didn't even bring up Boris Johnson, but everyone else did. Look, Luke, can you just, like, you do these all the time, like, unpack that a bit for us and also kind of link it into what does it tell you about Reform's prospects at the local elections next week and the mayoral elections? And also there's a by-election in Runcorn as well.
So it was really interesting hearing what they said about Nigel Farage and Reform UK, because it wasn't actually massively effusive about Farage personally. And we're starting to pick that up in a few more focus groups. It's a bit like, I like what Reform are saying. People tend to particularly like what they say on immigration. But I've got a few questions about him. And a word I've heard in other groups is baggage. He's got a lot of baggage. He's been around a long time, which is interesting because, of course, he has. But what you're hearing there is people are slightly willing to put that aside because someone will say, well, look, it is basically, we tried the Tories for 14 years. We're not that happy with what we've had from Labour so far, so we may as well roll the dice on this guy. And I think that's what you're going to see next week is that rolling the dice.
Is there less jeopardy because it's local and mayoral elections rather than picking a prime minister?
Yeah, and look, part of voting in a local election, and people wouldn't express it like this, but you sort of hear it from how they talk about it, is as much about sending a signal to the government that they're unhappy as saying that we want Nigel Farage to suddenly become prime minister. And it's interesting when you ask who would make the best PM, and again, you hear it that there, you got Keir and Farage tied, you've got Kemi Badenoch quite a bit further back, but none of the above still beats them all. So it's quite interesting, despite running on this kind of anti-incumbent changing, Farage isn't doing as well as he might be doing. I think he will do very well next week. They might merge with the largest number of council seats, win some key mayoralties. On the current polling, they should win that Runcorn by-election as well. But it's whether he can sustain that and whether that sort of baggage, when I'm just a little bit not sure, sticks. Flip side, and you heard there about Kemi Badenoch, is I just think the biggest difficulty for the Tories is they're not seen to be on the pitch. And it is difficult for people. Things just are not cutting through to them. And, when I asked at the beginning, do you know who the leader of the Conservative Party is? And you had a couple of people knew it. That is the same across our focus groups. It is not cutting through, and it's difficult because Nigel Farage, you heard it there, is so good at seizing the political agenda. Keir Starmer and Labour in government, the Tories aren't getting in there.
What you all need to do is you need to go and watch this on YouTube just to watch Ruth's facial expressions. There was the Boris Johnson should come back moment. That was fun. Both Harriet and Ruth gave a massive eye roll. And then when Luke said Kemi's not on the pitch, she looked at me and gave an emphatic nod, because obviously that's been your argument
for a long time, is that when you're in opposition you have to hustle, you have to look like you want it. It does not surprise me in the slightest that people are saying, well, the Tories aren't saying anything. I don't know who their leader is, and they're not saying anything anyway, because they're right.
And the best that could be said was that this was a positive strategy of laying low. I mean, you don't win elections by laying low.
But Harriet, when you listen to those remarks, particularly kind of about everything's broken, nothing works in politics, why not try Farage because we don't like that posh guy Starmer? Does it worry you? Does it worry you that actually, whilst the focus still is on the Conservative versus Reform, that actually Farage is coming for Labour?
Well, I think a government has always got to be worried. Government should never be relaxed or complacent. You've always got to be pushing uphill to deliver things. You've always got to be winning and rebuilding people's trust. So it's two things. People have got to feel better and the practicalities have got to be better, and the two are linked. So I think the thing about midterm elections is they're either a way of a party building itself up until the general election, or else it's a protest vote. And it feels as if there's going to be a protest vote, which is going to go to reform. But the question is that building for then the next general election, or is it going to stay at the level of a protest vote? I mean, I can remember so well many midterm elections when the Tories were in the ascendancy with Margaret Thatcher and then John Major, where on election night, the whole map would go red. And yet, come the general election, it would disappear. So the question is, when we get to the next general election, is Reform going to be able to sustain what they're building and be the effective opposition? Or is it going to default back to the Tories being the official opposition, the contenders for government?
Well, there was another longer term question that struck me about all of this, which is both Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer are less popular than their parties at the moment from that focus group and from other polling that's out there and from the none of the above comment that you've made. And when the leader becomes a drag anchor on the party, it's fine when the party's winning. When the party underperforms, that's when questions get asked. So, you know, the fact that nobody knows who Kemi Badenoch is from these focus groups is a different question. But for these two parties that are doing well and in the ascendancy, if there's no improvement on what people think of their leaders, I mean, despite the fact they look so secure at the moment, is there something that we should be maybe looking for 2-3 years from now?
Perhaps, but the thing that I would say, and the thing which people do say, if you do a specific focus group on the sort of Tory post-mortem, what comes up almost straight away, God, they just chopped and changed all the time, didn't they? You know, they had, but we elected Boris, and then they say, well, there was that woman who was there for like 40 days or something, and she went, and then we got Rishi Sunak, and they just kept changing, and they couldn't do it. So I think it would be quite a dangerous strategy for Labour to reach for that. But the flip side is, you know, as much as Farage has baggage, and people like the message more than the messenger, they've got no one else. People know who he is. He's been around a long time, but also he cuts through. And that's the thing. He knows how to, you know, whatever his flaws might be. The reason people in that focus group talk about him is because they hear from him.
You know, Farage has got about the same number of MPs as the Green Party in Westminster, but has, you know, got the microphone of the official opposition, essentially, right now.
No, completely. And one of the things which always slightly baffles me, you know, has baffled me since the election is, you know, you clearly got some left-wing discontent that we pick up in other focus groups with Labour on. I mean, you heard it on the benefit cuts in that focus group. You hear it on sometimes things like immigration, sometimes things like aid. Why aren't the Greens doing better? And it is a really interesting question that, you know, my prior before the election was the Greens would become the repository for left-wing discontent with Labour in the way the Lib Dems used to, you know, of Iraq and things under the Blair government. Just not on the pitch at all. The Liberal Democrats, people find them sort of inoffensive, but they couldn't say much about the party in the group. In fact, the one policy that someone referred to was their tuition fees policy back in, and Nick Clegg.
I was
and
like,
then it was,
wow. That's a long tail, isn't it?
Oh, that has stuck.
Cut through. It's a long shadow, isn't it?
Yeah. Whoa, 15 years, still going.
That has stuck, and that comes up in other groups too. And then it's Ed Davies stunts. And so you've got to sort of, I mean, maybe it's no bad thing for the Liberal Democrats if they're existing on being a kind of anti-Tory vote branch of the Labour Party in the home counties, but they're not doing the running in the same way.
So we've got next week, we've got the Runcorn by-election. We've got how many council seats? 1,600 up for grabs? 6 mayoral races. I'm going to ask you before you go just to give me a vague prediction.
We've got an MS.
Look, he's like glaring at me now. He was smiling before.
I mean, predictions are a bit of a fool's game, but I think if Reform really should be aiming to win sort of 500, 600 seats if they're on a par with the polling, Conservative losses, I think, at a sort of similar level. Labour may be treading water. I mean, Labour just don't have that many seats up. These are not Labour areas who are voting. But I think if Reform don't win that Runcorn by-election, then they are not matching their national polling in getting out the vote. And then there's those mayorals. I think, you know, looking at balanced probabilities, it should go Reform, and that will show you, you know, quite how much you're on the ascendancy.
And also, just on that third thing about the point about these locals is that the Tories have got a particularly hard time because they're defending seats that were last up in 2021 in the middle of Boris Johnson mania and a COVID vaccine bounce. And at some points they were polling at near 50% back then. So anyway, we'll have it all on Sky News, and we're doing a special podcast. We'll probably get Luke back. You're going to love it. If you're into elections, there's no place you'd rather be than with us. And also, I should say, there's a full list of candidates in all the Doncaster elections in the show notes of this podcast. Thank you all for that. I hope you found that informative and interesting, because I certainly learned a thing or two. But that's all we have time for. Keep sending us your...
Not quite we all have time for, because we are going to wish you good luck in your London Marathon. And in fact, not just Harriet and I are going to wish you good luck. We also have only got Paula bloody Radcliffe to wish you good luck.
No,
listen to this. Yeah, we have. Yeah, we have.
Hi Beth, it's Paula Radcliffe here, and I just wanted to wish you the very, very best of luck in your marathon on Sunday. My last minute tips would be to make sure that you have carbo loaded, because it's going to be a little bit warmer this year. Carb load, using liquids, make sure that that water is there to bind the glycogen into the muscles. Make sure you lay your kit out the night before. You make sure that you've got 2 shoes, 2 socks, obviously. You've worn the kit before. Maybe pin the number on then as well, so there's less to worry about in the morning. Pre-book your meal for the night before, because that would really help. And take some old clothes to stay warm while you're hanging around at the start line. Most of all, really enjoy it. You've done all the hard work in training. This is the party time now. So go out and smash it on Sunday.
So there you go. World champion, London Marathon record holder, and also pod buddy with Paula's Marathon Run Club podcast that tells you how to bind your glycogen. I don't even know what binding your glycogen is, but there you go. How about that? Wishing you all the very best, my dear.
And all in a good cause as well. Well done you, Beth. I can't believe it. How many miles? Just tell me once again, how many miles is a marathon?
26.
Oh my Lord, I just cannot believe that.
I'm actually speechless, and I'm not normally rendered that. I can't believe it.
Yeah,
Paula Radcliffe, give me a shout out. That is really nice. That's lovely.
If you want to send your best wishes messages to Beth for Sunday, do that, and anything else you want to talk to us about. We love hearing from you. Get on the burner phone. The number to WhatsApp is 07934 200 444, or you can email electoraldysfunction@sky.uk.
Oh, thanks so much, guys. And I will hopefully be back completely intact next week, and with a medal, fingers crossed. So thank you for that, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.